The esteemed privilege of the last presentation I get to do this year. I'm very excited. And some of you, those that know me will know that I travel all the time. But this is the last trip of 2018. I'm so excited. My wife and kids are actually more excited, but nonetheless. So this will be a fun one to finish on. Now that said, if you look at this topic, it's actually not the funnest topic in the world. It's unfortunate that we actually have to talk about fraud and cybercrime, but it's good that we can talk about leveraging technology to help prevent that, because it is a reality. Fraud and cybercrime is everywhere. It doesn't matter what survey you look at, there's more and more attempts to try and steal our money, steal our data, steal basically anything they can possibly get that has value. And when it comes to Treasury, we are the guardians of financial assets. We're the guardians of cash, and we're the ones that have to have that last line of defense. So what I'm going to talk about today is pretty simple. 4 different things in terms of fraud prevention. I'm going to focus most of my attention on payments, but in fairness, there's more fraud in Treasury than just payments. Payments just tends to be the one that everybody wants to get at, right? Yeah. So I'm going to talk about a framework that really starts with awareness. Now, most of you are probably fairly aware, but some of the stats I might show you might be a little bit eye-opening, a little bit concerning, and if that's the case, good, because then we brought more attention to fraud and making sure that you are aware of what the different possibilities and threats that are out there. But then we'll get into some of the solutions, and we'll talk about information security, we'll talk about workflow controls, and we'll talk about payment screening as different methods and opportunities to help reduce fraud. Sound reasonable? Okay. We can spend our time talking about other things, so if it doesn't sound good, we can do other stuff. But no, I think this is generally the framework that I follow. But the first thing has to be awareness. So when I say awareness, why should Treasury care about fraud? It's stats like this. It's really quite scary if you think about it. I mean, you just look at AFP studies, 78%. That was an increase from 76% the year before, from 74%. If you look back 5, 6, 7 years, you're going to find that that percentage has steadily increased every single year of organizations that admit that they are actually affected by fraud attempts. Not necessarily successful fraud attempts, but just have been affected by having to prevent fraud. Now, the interesting thing is, when I look at a number like 78%, what do you think of when you see 78% of organizations said that they had fraud attempts in 2017?
I thought it was higher.
Yeah, it tells you that 22% lied, right? I mean, let's be honest about it. It's a sensitive subject. I wouldn't blame anyone for doing that. You're like, I don't think I'm allowed to say yes to that, so I'll say no. That's a reality that we face, is that everybody runs into this. So I see numbers like that, and I appreciate why AFP asked the way they did. They asked the question not saying, have you been affected by fraud? They said, have you faced attempted fraud? Just to try and soften it, and that's why the number was 78%. We all know it would be higher. That said, there was a survey that actually came out. Treasury Today published it just about a week or maybe 2 weeks ago. And it was actually a survey by an organization called WEX, which is like a payment software platform. But they did this survey, and they interviewed 1,000 treasurers in the UK and in Northern Europe. Out of those 1,000 treasurers, 52% admitted that actually they'd been not just attempted fraud, but they'd seen real fraud in their organization. They had actually lost money. 52%. Now, in fairness, we all kind of have that, okay, well, obviously not everyone said yes that it actually run into this. That means that real number is probably higher. That's kind of scary. That means that the majority of organizations, by some degree, face payments fraud in terms of having to explain to the CFO, yes, we lost money because of this. That's the scary part. So when we're talking about awareness, it's being that you're not alone. If you run into this, certainly, theoretically speaking, 52% or more of you will have run into this at some point. It's a problem that needs to be dealt with. And you look at some of these other ones, like 56% of CIOs, so we look at the information side, not necessarily just Treasury, but you look at the information side of the organization, and you look at 56% of those CIOs say that phishing is probably the biggest problem, it's the biggest priority. We all know what phishing is. We all know how it can happen. Most organizations have tests that go out. As you know, from a Kyriba standpoint, we have that, and there's people that fail. And the reason why you do those tests is to make sure that you are actually looking at just the simple things, like the emails. Are they actually from the right address? Or is there a dot something that's not .com? Or is there some spelling mistake? Or is there an ink at the end of the company name that we expected to see? It's all these sorts of things that, even though they're so simple, they're the ones that ultimately catch us. I mean, even just as on my way over here, my wife sent me a text that she'd received about an invoice that looked like it was from Amazon. And it was like, click on this just to confirm whatever it was, like your shipment. And I was like, no, don't do it. She already knew not to do it. But the point is that these things can be disguised to look like the real thing. So even though phishing is only one of the very few ways that we see fraud perpetrated, the fact is that CIOs recognize it's an evolving threat. So that's why I put that number up there. I put this number up here. 23% of treasurers have done nothing new to combat fraud in the last 12 months. Now, fortunately, it's only 23%. It's not 73% or something higher than that. Most organizations recognize that the threats are continuing to get more sophisticated. As a result, the actions need to become more sophisticated as well. But still, 23% means that there's a quarter of organizations that are like, ah, we're good. Does that seem like the right response, given everything else that we're looking at here? No, it's not. But that's also some of the inertia, some of the, well, we haven't been affected, or not badly, so therefore what we're doing must be okay. That's not the case. It needs to be a progressive kind of attitude to fight cybercrime and fraud. Last one's here, 191 days to find a data breach. Now that's a statistic that's beyond Treasury, but still, that's kind of petrifying. 191 days, yes, do the math, that's more than 6 months. That's a lot of time to figure out, oops, something happened. Now in Treasury, we can pride ourselves in the fact that we do our reconciliations both daily as well as monthly. We should find these things if there was any payments fraud, but I've run into many instances where the lack of visibility into Treasury activity, let's just say if you're a decentralized organization and you have cash flows that maybe you don't reconcile every day, maybe you don't reconcile every week, maybe you don't even reconcile every month, depending on the organization. Maybe you have your local geographies do that. I've seen these sorts of situations where it's not inconceivable that it takes months to figure it out. There's an organization that worked with us as a client. Before they came to us, they really didn't have visibility outside the United States. Once they actually came online with the Treasury system, they got visibility across all of their accounts, including in Asia, where ultimately had a problem. But they didn't know this until they started doing daily reconciliations of all of their accounts, and they realized that these small dollar accounts, or small yuan accounts, because it was in China, once they actually got visibility into those, they found that there was a pattern, that something wasn't quite right. It was small, it was the equivalent of about $3,000 or $4,000 per day on average, but you do the math, and you're like, it's actually a decent paycheck if you look at it. And that was something that there was actually fraud happening, but it was in such small amounts that it was under the radar screen. And that's the kind of things that why it takes a length of time to sometimes find and uncover fraud. So it can be, it doesn't have to be the giant wire for millions of dollars that gets extracted. It can be those little things. And if any of you run into, say, credit card fraud, where you've had your number stolen, your actual credit card stolen, typically what happens at first, they try it out. So there's a couple transactions at the 7-Eleven or something like that just to see if the card or the number is good. And then once it is, then they go to Best Buy and they suddenly buy like the largest television and entertainment system you've ever seen. That's the sort of pattern, and the same thing works in Treasury as well. There's under the radar screen transactions, and then there's ones that sort of they go for the big one. And so being aware of what those patterns look like is very important. The other thing to be aware of is also the fact that fraud affects more than just payments. So even though I'm going to spend most of my time today talking about payments, the fact is that if you look at all these other questions, they touch on different areas of Treasury, and fraud can happen anywhere. It can be around your bank accounts. It can be around just having standard settlement instructions attached to your FX or your investments. And I've seen examples of this. I know it sounds obvious and ridiculous, but there's organizations that if they have manual process, they can simply say, oh yeah, that FX wire, I'll just manually put that in and just save a little bit for myself. Or maybe they have some deal with the trader, which I know you're like, oh, that would never happen. Yeah, it happens. So these are the sorts of things, if you think about what do we have to protect, yes, payments is number one, but if you look at all the other pieces in terms of the systems as a whole, Look at other workflows such as investments or foreign exchange or just the signatories on bank accounts, and you realize that fraud actually can affect more than just payments, and being aware of that is extremely important. Make sense? Scared yet? It's just the start of the presentation until you get to the rest. But no, I mean, it is scary in a way, and that's why we talk about it, to make sure that you have that good awareness, appreciating the different schemes that are out there, but also appreciating what areas of our treasury operation are potentially at risk. And once you appreciate that, then you can start thinking about how can we protect those? What sort of simulations and scenarios can we run to ensure that a bad actor doesn't get access? Whether it's external or internal, we make sure that those things aren't happening. So it's a combination of being aware, but also thinking of what sort of tests and actions can we run, maybe in collaboration with IT. Maybe the CIO can have folks that they can construct some sort of scenario that can actually test your resilience against some of these different factors. Okay, so that's awareness. I could go on and on about awareness, but I won't, because it's not that fun to talk about. What is fun to talk about is how can we protect ourselves, and there's 3 different components to the presentation I'm going to go into. The first one is information security. So when we think of information security, it's pretty obvious. How do we keep our treasury information secure? Hence the name. The interesting thing is that the cloud. We all know the cloud. We're all used to it. We've all heard about it. It's a little scary because our data is hosted elsewhere, but here's the interesting fun fact. IT, your CIO, your CISO, your CTO, which didn't used to be 3 different people, but now are in the organization, 3 different departments, they actually favor the cloud. The reason why is because they know, if done properly, it's a big if, by the way, if done properly, the cloud can actually be safe, and more safe than what you can do internally. And the biggest reason is because there's a huge threat, and it always has been a huge threat. Insiders can actually get access to information. They can get access to systems. There's actually more security by having your data outside your 4 walls than there is inside. But it's not just the fact that the data resides outside when it's in the cloud, it's also that a cloud provider, so whether it's IBM, whether it's someone like Amazon Web Services, whether it's Microsoft Azure, the fact is that any of these organizations, their whole livelihood and reputation is based on making sure that your data is safe. And what that means is that they're able to invest so much more in the right controls, protections, barriers, all these things that keep data safe. They have more resources at their disposal than your IT department does. And your IT department knows that. They know what should be done, they also know what their budget is, and they know often that they're 2 different things. What I'd like to do and what I can do are not the same. And as a result, IT typically favors the cloud. That didn't used to be the case. 10 years ago, that was not the case. 5 years ago, sometimes yes, sometimes no. Now, IT will push you to the cloud anyway. Anyone has a treasury system that's installed, the database is probably in the cloud somewhere. Even if it's not the cloud in terms of your vendor, same with your ERP, the data is probably still pushed to the cloud by your IT group because they recognize they want it there. It's better protection. Now, that said, you can see the second bullet point. If you are going to the cloud from a treasury standpoint, you know they're going to ask you a lot of questions. Like pages and pages of questions. Anyone that's gone through this, seen the IT questionnaires, they're enormous. They're thousands of questions long in many cases. And that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. I know you think, oh goodness, IT's involved, this is going to take a long time. Yes, that's true, but it comes from a good place because they want to make sure that whatever cloud you choose in Treasury, whether it's your Treasury management system, whether it's the ERP, which probably isn't your choice, but yes, you're part of that, whether it's your trading platform, whether it's your hedge accounting system, whatever it might be, they want to make sure that whatever you've chosen as a cloud tool aligns with their information security program. They don't want Treasury to be on an island from a security standpoint, if that makes sense. So the things, and this gets a little bit technical, this part isn't as colorful. The next slides get technical. In terms of application security is really how you access the system. If anyone, you all have bank portals, I assume, you all know how the tokens work. It's called 2-factor authentication. That's application security. That's an example of that. Vendor security basically is what is that particular provider doing? What is my bank doing to keep my data secure? What is SAP or Oracle doing to keep my data secure? What is your treasury system doing to keep your data secure? It's basically what are they doing to make sure you're protected. Physical security is really the actual data center itself. So it could be Amazon, it could be Microsoft, it could be IO, it could be IBM, whoever it is that's where that data is actually hosted, what are they doing to keep things secure? Last one is process security. This is like things like audits. Anyone's heard of things like SAS 70 and SSA 16, SOC 1 and SOC 2, all these abbreviations which are so difficult for us to remember in Treasury. That's what we're talking about, process security. What's being checked and balanced to ensure that the right things are continually being done. What sort of monitoring is in place. So to go through these in a little bit more detail, application security, here's the simple statement. This is not just a professional Treasury statement, it's also a personal one. User ID and password, not enough. I think we all know that, right? This is where I want to see nods. I want to see nods. Yes, we know this, right? User ID and password are not enough. For your own personal email, if you're on Gmail, you're on Yahoo, you're on Hotmail, just user ID and password, no matter how great that password might be, not enough. It can be guessed. By me? No. By anyone in the room? Maybe not. Unless you use like your dog's name and then 123 or something like that, which don't ever do, by the way. Unless you use a simple password, a person isn't going to get it, but guess what? An algorithm will. And cyber criminals use algorithms. So the key is that that password can be guessed. Now, even if it can't be guessed because you're so good at making passwords, guess what can happen? You can get a hyperlink in an email. You can get a picture, like some YouTube thing, with cats and dogs. My mom sends me dog ones because I have a dog. And I never open them. She doesn't know that. But I never open them. Not because they're from her. I think they're probably very funny. But the fact is, it's just one malicious click. Now, the irony is, the reason I don't open them is because every 3 months I get an email from her, oh, I got hacked again, my email is compromised. Yeah, you did, because you keep opening all these dog videos, and eventually it's going to catch up with you. And that's the thing, is that even if your password was so great, one click, and suddenly there's a virus in there that can capture your password. And if the password was the only thing protecting your email, or your Facebook, or your Twitter, or your bank website, or whatever have you, then that means you're compromised that easily. So that's why we talk about things like strong password controls, which is basically a good password. For me, yeah, great password is good, but it's not enough. Two-factor authentication, IP filtering. If you don't know what IP filtering is, log into your bank website, like whether it's personal or professional, log into your bank website from a computer that it's never seen before with your user ID and password. What does it ask you for? Yeah, questions about like your favorite ice cream and stuff. That's IP filtering at work. It recognizes that this is not the device that you normally log in from, so let's figure out if it's really you. So that's IP filtering. Single sign-on, most of you in a professional sense probably know single sign-on. It's basically where IT controls the login, and they actually tie the login to whatever application you're working with. They tie it to your Windows user ID. So IT is controlling everything, which is actually a very positive thing. Of all these different choices, single sign-on is probably one of the best security mechanisms because it actually aligns your whole sign-in process. It's not saying, okay, well, our bank, does multi-factor authentication, but they have these darn tokens, so I have a drawer full of tokens, or maybe they use my cell phone, or maybe they use something called YubiKey, I don't even know what that is. The fact is that you can actually align all of that so that you have one security paradigm that is controlled and managed by your CIO or CISO. So that's a good thing. So single sign-on is usually the best one, but if that's not an option for your bank platform, because most banks don't play along with that, then make sure you have at least one, if not more, of the other things. And keep that as a lesson for your personal lives too. If you have your email, which is, I know there's lots of fun things, your email, like, I don't care if anyone gets into that, but generally speaking, you'll find out that your Amazon orders and all the other stuff that you realize if someone got control of that could actually be fairly harmful to you. Put two-factor authentication in there. Make sure there's IP filtering. Make sure these setups and controls are there so that if someone got your user ID and password, they don't get very far. That's the key thing we want in Treasury applications. We also want in our personal lives as well. So I can spend a little bit extra time on application security simply because it has more than just a Treasury application. It actually has a personal application as well. Now, talking about physical security. So this is actually what we talk about in terms of how is the actual cloud protected physically. The cloud is basically, yes, it's all of the internet, but your data actually resides on a device in some sort of data center. That's pretty much how it works. It's not up here in the clouds. I actually talked to someone once that really thought it was. Okay, different conversation. But the point is that there's a lot of things you can do. And if you look at just number 3, I'll actually start from the bottom and work my way up. A world-class data center, everyone says they're world-class, so don't buy into that. Everyone's going to say they're world-class. It means nothing. It's just like industry-leading, market-leading, #1 in the industry. That's what marketing people write. It doesn't mean anything. So the key things that do mean stuff are some of these capabilities. And I've only put a few of them in there. Your IT group would ask for a much longer laundry list of features and capabilities to ensure, yes, they are doing the right things so that someone cannot walk in or take a truck and drive in to that data center and actually steal that hardware. Or take a USB and plug it into that hardware and start stealing information like in Mission Impossible or something like that. That actually can happen, by the way. So all of these things, and I just put up 5 bullet points because in fairness, I didn't have that much room on the slide to put more. You get the idea. There's a lot of stuff there that needs to be figured out, and it is important. But the other things that are important is that you would expect your cloud vendor to be able to provide what's called a Network Operations Center. The short for that is NOC. If you heard that, like in spy movies, well, that's what it means, Network Operations Center. And really what it is it's some sort of center where it's monitoring the cloud to ensure that nothing bad is happening. Bad happening could be that the service goes down. That's not good if you're using the cloud software. But also making sure there's no intrusions. These are the sorts of things that need to happen. You also have a cyber defense center, which is completely based on intrusions, both on the real and then the hypothetical, and they offer something called security incident event management. If anyone's ever been hacked, and let's just say, I'll just pick on an organization like Marriott, because I'm a Marriott member. They got hacked, right? That was a pretty big one, 500 million members, and I was one of them. Cool. That got information got taken. Mine wasn't too bad, but maybe some of you in the room might have been. Their security incident event management was actually halfway good, in the sense that they figured it out pretty quickly, and they took action to try and mitigate what that risk was. That's what security incident event management was. If you remember when Equifax was hacked, which was what, like last year? That wasn't so good, because when did we hear about that? Our information had been in the wind for like over a year before we heard about it. That's a lot of time for cyber criminals to do something with that. That's the difference between having good security incident event management and not having any at all. So I know that seems like something like, how do I even know that? Your IT group is going to ask your cloud vendors to figure that out. So whoever you're dealing with in the cloud, from a treasury system standpoint, or trading platform standpoint, or you're working with someone like FXall for trading, whatever, the point is that all of these things are what your IT group is going to want. I don't even know what's being asked. All I know is someone else is going to ask questions, and someone else is going to answer them, and I just need to make sure that the questionnaires go to the right people. Yes, that is your responsibility in treasury. Make sure your vendors answer every single question that's being asked of them so that the right people in your organization can evaluate the effectiveness of this control. Make sense? Okay, promise me you'll do that? Okay, that's all I'm asking. I just want you to make sure that the right things are being done. Now, with vendor security, I actually had colleagues on my side at Kyriba that did a webinar. They pretty much spent about half an hour on this slide. They made more slides than that because they wanted just this one slide and talk to it for half an hour, and I said, no, you can't do that. That's just wrong. But the point is that there's a lot of depth behind this. I'm not going to go into it. The point around something around vendor security is that generally you would want your providers, whether it's banks or whether it's software providers, to actually go through all of these things. Everything from, like, if you look at vulnerability management, look at penetration testing. Penetration testing, by the way, if any of you are curious, it's basically when you hire a firm like Symantec or McAfee or someone like that, someone you've heard of that does virus protection, and you basically hire them to hack your system and see if they're successful. And hopefully they're not, but they write a letter to say, here's what we found or here's what we didn't. As a consumer, as a client of a cloud vendor, you would want that letter. That's part of the kind of thing we're talking about with vendor security. You want to see that letter from McAfee or Symantec or Qualys or whoever it is, and you want them to say, we didn't find anything that was really, really bad. we were not able to hack into the system. And we were given credentials in the system, we couldn't get around, we hacked from the outside, we couldn't get in. Those are the sorts of things that you want. I know that seems like sensitive information, but why wouldn't you want to have that? You would. And if your provider isn't giving you that, to me, that's a red flag. Because why wouldn't they give you that? Why wouldn't they give you that assurance? And that's to be said for all of these different capabilities. Something simple like data encryption at rest. You know what that means? It basically means that the servers itself that the data is hosted on, if someone literally came in and took it, they wouldn't be able to read it. You would want that. Now, you're not saying that that's what's going to happen, that the server is going to get taken away, but if they did, you would want to make sure that data is unreadable. That's the kind of things. And again, these are all different check marks. The point is there's a lot of questions to be asked, and there's a lot of questions to be answered. If those questions aren't asked, you're making a lot of assumptions that your provider, that your vendor, that your partner in this is actually doing the right things. So, important things to ask without exposing you to a lot of technical speak. I could do that, but that'd be a little cruel because, you know, I'm sure some of you will get a little hungry and we want to make sure we don't spend too much time in the presentation on that. So there's a lot of stuff, and again, it just comes to making sure those questions are asked and answered. Last one I'm going to talk about before we talk about fun things is around risk governance. So you look at a lot of these things and you think, I don't even know what those things are. That's okay, you don't need to. But the bottom one that I put in bold, you probably do. That's the one where we see, oh yeah, that audit that we get asked for. I do know that one. That's fine. The other ones are just examples of questions you want to make sure the vendor is doing. You want to make sure they're monitoring the cloud for you. You want to make sure they have the right people doing the right things. You want to make sure they have separation of duties so that their developers don't have access to production data. You want to make sure that their support team can't go, oh, we'll just change that. We'll just delete that user and we'll put a new user in. In fact, I can log into your system myself. These are the sorts of things you don't want happening, and that's what's called risk governance. There's different aspects of that. The bottom one, in terms of SOC 1, SOC 2, that's the part that looks a little bit familiar. I know some of you are thinking, oh, thank goodness. It's been 3 slides. I didn't understand anything that was on any of those, but I do know that one. Yay for me. Good. That is actually the only one you probably would have recognized. And the interesting part about that, though, is it's still a bit confusing. If you think of this, and I put this in the table here, SAS 70, remember that? Doesn't exist anymore. SSAE 16, remember that? For some of you, and you're like, oh yeah, that's what replaced the SAS 70. It also doesn't exist anymore. Now it's an SSAE 18. Try and remember that. It took me a little while too, so don't worry. Point is that there's a lot of vocabulary here, and what it comes down to is that you don't need to remember all of it. But if you do, you'll be very popular with IT. That's not necessarily a good thing always. But if you need that water cooler discussion around this time of year just to kind of get some favors out of them, start talking their language and start to figure out what is it that I really need? What is it that my organization is looking for? And generally speaking, this is why I put all these things up here. There's 2 things. One, there's a lot of reports, and we're going to talk about that in a second. The other one is that you have to evaluate. It's an essay. This is not a multiple choice question. It's not a true-false. It's not a pass-fail. The presence of such a report doesn't mean that organization did everything right. I worked for an organization, it's not Kyriba, but before that actually did a very bad, it was the equivalent of failing their SOC 2 report. I mean, there is no fail, so it couldn't really do that, but it was so bad that when it was read, people were like, what's wrong with that organization? And there's a lot of things wrong, that's why I left. But point is that understanding the nuances of this, SOC 1, it just tells you controls exist. It's basically saying, you know, do I understand that there's exam questions? Are my answers good? Did I pass that class? Maybe yes, maybe no. I just understand. Yes, there are exam questions, and yes, Bob wrote answers to those questions. Were they good answers? That's what SOC 2 is for. Just knowing, yes, he answered every question. Is that useful? Not so much. SOC 3, that just tells you, it's a summary. It's like, yes, there were some good answers, and in general, Bob did a nice job. You know, kind of like that report card your kids get in grade 3, right? It's like, you know, there's no grades. It's just like, yeah, it's everything positive, everything's rosy. That's what the SOC 3 is. The SOC 2 is actually the important one. But it's misleading because SOC 3 3 is bigger than 2, so you would think just by nature this is a better number, a better report to get, but it's actually not. You want the SOC 2, and you want the SOC 2 type 2. That's a mouthful, isn't it? SOC 2, type 2. At least they're both 2, so that's helpful. But the point is that it's an essay. It needs to be read, it needs to be evaluated, and us in Treasury are not equipped to evaluate the effectiveness of that audit. They will not know what is the security behind the controls, and are they good or are they not good. That's where your CIO and CISO are going to come into play. So I know there's a theme here when it comes to information security. Does Treasury have a role in information security? Not so much. Your role is to make sure that the questions get asked and the questions get answered. And one of those is making sure you get the right report in the right people's hands. So the good part is that not a lot of responsibility, just make sure that the right things are being asked, and that's a key component of the cloud. IT knows that it can be better. However, I stress there's a lot of questions to ask. And if you want to ask those, feel free, but certainly engaging your IT group in a selection process or reevaluation or just check to make sure that you're doing the right things is important, and that's why we put something like this there. Now, that's not the fun part of the presentation. In fact, that's the least fun part of anything I'm going to talk about this evening. But it is the important part because it's the one that's often overlooked. Most organizations don't ask these questions because Treasury is like, oh no, we'll just, we'll take their word that, and I'm just being somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but we'll take their word that they did the right thing because we talked to other customers, they use them, and they seem to be okay. And I'm being, again, a bit sarcastic, but the reality is that most IT groups, I'm not in the sales side of my organization, I get pulled into engagements sometimes. Of the ones I get pulled into, which are usually very complex sales, only about 50% of those is the CIO's team involved in the selection process. It's not enough. It should be 100% of the time for all of these reasons. If you want to protect and have the right controls against fraud and cybercrime, you need to make sure that the right things are being done on the information security side to protect your information. Now, that is only part of it, and that's why I'm not going to talk anymore about it. I'm going to talk about fun things like what we do in Treasury in our workflows. So if you look at this is a simple diagram. It's got pretty circles and colors and all those sorts of things. That's how you know it's simple, because Bob did it as opposed to like someone complex. So if you think of just from a payment standpoint, we request a payment, and we get that, we initiate it in whatever system we have, we approve it, we have some sort of documentation that we might review as part of that approval, and then obviously we send it on to the bank. And that could be through the bank portal, it could be through your ERP, it could be your treasury management system. If you're very decentralized, there might be different systems depending on the payment. Supplier payments go one way, treasury payments another, legal has something else. It doesn't really matter. The point is that these are typically the steps that you have. The issue that we run into in Treasury is that there's typically not a standardized process. Most organizations have at least 2 different systems connecting to the bank for payments. One Treasury, one ERP. Sometimes Treasury might be, well, these payments go just to the bank portal directly, these ones come from our TMS, these ones come from our ERP, so suddenly that's 3 different systems you're talking about. The point is that you don't have what's called standardized controls. You don't have consistency. Different payment scenarios are dealt with differently. And that's where we create exceptions. Those exceptions can be exploited. How are they exploited? Remember phishing and spear phishing and all those sorts of things. Vishing is another term. All of these ones, basically, you have people, whether it's on the inside or the outside, that figure out how you do payments. If you ever wonder how these phishing expeditions, so to speak, actually are successful from a fraud standpoint, it's because they figured out the pattern of the CEO or the CFO or the treasurer. They figured out when they're out of the office. No, it's not coincidence that they actually tried this when the treasurer was out of the office. It's these sorts of scenarios where there's some inconsistency between geography, people, and type of payment, amount of payment, when they were in the office, when they weren't, when they were just about to get on an airplane, when they're unavailable to answer their phone for a callback. All these sorts of things, it's not a coincidence because there's other ways of getting that information. The key thing is no matter who initiates a payment, no matter where they're based, no matter how much it's for, there should be consistency around your controls. It doesn't mean that you have the same level of approvers for a $50 million wire as you do for a $10,000 ACH. But the fact is that you want consistency across your payment structures. If you don't,